do what we need to do. So our first speaker this morning is a man who needs no introduction. Last time he spoke at the SCANZ conference, he was Minister of Research, Science and Technology. Honourable Steve Maharey, now Vice-Chancellor of Massey University. Steve, welcome. Thanks for your support of SCANZ. We look forward to hearing you speak to us today.
Thanks, Phil.
Well, Phil, can I say that the opening was overwhelming. I don't know if you've ever watched the Concord. Have you ever seen the Concords? You know, they do the rhinoceros, all that sort of stuff. And you'll know there's a very famous line in there, which is embedded in our household, where he turns to the other rapper and says, "Steve, what sort of rap name is Steve?" So I had been tempted this morning to kind of do a little bit of rap, being an old country kind of person. That would have been a stretch from anyway, but after that I thought not. I think he's right. What sort of rap name is Steve? Just stick with other things. It's good to be back. Been away a little while. Thought I might run for politics again soon. Don't like what I see what's going on. So you are the beginning of my campaign. I'm just kidding. I'm having a great time at Massey. I know there are a few Massey people here. It's a great time to be at universities. We'll come back to some of those things as we go through. But it is a really interesting time. There are lots of challenges, no money, all the kinds of things that we all talk about. But it's also a time of massive change. So if you're in a university right now, you're probably feeling like you're right at the cutting edge of doing new and different things for universities, which is very much at the heart of what I want to say today. So thank you very much for having me back. Can I acknowledge all of you for the work that you do? There are many of you who I have grown to know over the years because we've done very similar things, and thank you for the work that you do, which is also a point I'll come back to. I just thought too I'd mention something very cutting edge that I'm trying to do at the moment, which is I'm on Twitter. I thought I'd move to Twitter. I went to a conference overseas a little while ago, and Bing, whatever his name is, the man who invented Twitter, was there. I always thought Twitter was for communicating about whether you had cheese in your sandwiches or whether the coffee was cold or where you were so your friends could find you. But actually his address was absolutely on the money, I thought. He talked about the fact that when he invented it, he actually meant it as an organisational tool. Yes, it was great that people told each other what they were eating for lunch and so on, but his greatest success, he thought, were things like the people in Tehran who had organised themselves through Twitter, or organisations that he heard about that were doing that. So that's what we're trying to do at Massey, use it as a tool of organisation to see whether 140 characters can lend themselves to a university telling its story in this kind of environment and organising itself in this kind of environment. So that's what we're trying to do, to see whether the whole experiment works. So if you're interested in what Massey is not, then please make use of not just our webpage, Facebook and so on, but follow the Twitter things that we're doing as well. I was asked to talk about what's on the screen. What are educational institutions from early childhood right through to universities doing to prepare scientists and people who are consuming science? What are we doing? What should we be doing as well? Now, what is the agenda for us? That's the question that I was given. I've reinterpreted that, given that this is a communicators conference, to say you're posing a question that I think most people have been asking for the last 10 years at least, which is to say, how do you produce scientists who can talk to a wider society? And how do you produce people who understand them when they hear them because they are literate with science? That's a question I think all societies in the West, in particular, as they've tried to think through the agenda of science, have been trying to answer, and we have been doing that for quite some time in New Zealand. So that's the way I thought I would interpret the question. It's a good question, and certainly one that's occupied me for a good period of time. As you know, I'm a social scientist, a sociologist by particular profession. And so you would expect someone like me through my career, from the end of the 1970s through to 1990, when I went fully into politics, you'd expect someone like me to say, yes, this is the way you should do things. Social science is about people, so we should be able to talk to people. But it's really interesting that it doesn't matter what kind of science you do. It has been a problem to get people who are scientists to communicate to people. Sociologists just the same. In fact, I often say to people I speak two languages, English and sociology. You can understand the first one but not the second. It's a very dense, impenetrable minefield when people come into disciplines like that, because of course it has its own jargon and so on. And I felt for myself that that was wrong, that we should be trying to communicate outside that, but I admit that we're not excluded from this problem of how you get science communicated properly. In the 1980s, for example, was a good start for us. We were studying the Springbok tour, trying to figure out why a tour which had apparently been about apartheid in South Africa actually became about how New Zealanders were divided amongst each other. Where'd that come from? What was that about? And of course, since it was about our country, we began trying to communicate with people all over the place about the idea of the Springbok tour being something about the divisions and splits of New Zealand society, which of course were very obvious by that time around Muldoon and all the things that were going on there. So communicating to the public became very important for me. So when I went into politics, I thought I would take that issue with me, that I would try to think about how do you get a connection between society and science. When I went into politics at the end of the 1980s in the City Council, before going into central politics, scientists were still largely referred to as boffins or some name like that, which distanced themselves from ordinary people. And really, most of the people who were interested in science were scientists themselves. They were talking with each other at that particular time. And I recall giving a speech to an audience in Palmerston North that was full of working scientists and people who were closely associated with them. That was the audience that was in the room. And I thought I would advance what I knew was a slightly challenging thesis, but one I thought should be talked about. And I said, I think that scientists should talk to people. They should get out of the lab and they should take their views and they should get alongside everyday citizens and they should say, this is what my work is, try to make it accessible to people, because after all, the people who are out there do pay taxes, they pay for what's going on in the lab, and they might want to know what's actually happening. There's a sea change going on in the world here, and we need to be thinking about how we connect with the people who are consuming and paying for our science. I thought it was a very simple and quite relevant point. And afterwards, I was accosted just after I got off the podium by a laboratory technician, laboratory technician, who came up to me and he was literally purple with rage, absolutely physically, he was just about to melt down. I won't say what he exactly said, because I think this is being recorded, but what he broadly said was, did I have fecal matter for brains? Because I must, he insisted, going on without pausing on an argument about this, and what his argument was, I must, if I thought that his boss, the scientist he was talking about, should talk to ordinary people. He explained to me that the great man had no time for this. He was in the lab, that people did not matter to him. This was not what it was about, and I should just drop this whole argument immediately because it was just totally foolish to think that scientists should be talking to people. And I noticed actually that his boss stood a couple of metres off during his argument and never said a word. Just absolutely appreciated the argument, in other words, and realised he was being championed. Now, I often wonder whether that young man remembers his words today, because of course today we take it for granted that people should communicate, get out of their lab, and the greatest scientists do it. I'm thinking of people like Ray Avery, Sir Paul Callaghan, Sir Peter Gluckman, all Knighthoods, by the way, all of them these days. It's a real shift too for scientists to be able to be in that kind of position. There's been an absolute change since the end of the 1980s through till now. People like that lead the way in communication, and the everyday scientist, if you put it that way, the young scientist coming through, is expected to have that skill. And if you go to a place like McDiamond, for example, to meet the research team and walk around there, every one of them seems to be a trained presenter. They sort of wander into a lab and they reel off as if they're on a TV show, how this works, what it is, how you connect to it. You think, where'd they get this from? Have they had specific training? Not really. It's an expectation. They've got used to explaining their science now, and that's the way, I guess, people like Sir Paul Callaghan, who of course was the founding person in McDiamond, would want things to be. And of course, each of us as citizens looking at scientists now are much more literate about what they do. We know who they are, we've got a sense of what they're on about. We are able to listen to them and take out of their messages things that we can apply to our own life. And they have got so good now that we watch them on television, we're glued to the set, and international and national scientists are capable of doing all of this kind of thing. So we're now in a situation where when we ask this question, we're answering it very positively. We can say, yes, we are producing scientists and we are producing people who are listening and hearing correctly what is going on. Scientists have come in from the margins of society, they're in the mainstream if you like, and we're enthusiastic about having them there. Now, it didn't come about by accident. It came about because of people like you. It has to be done if this is going to happen. It was never going to happen just by saying it should. There had to be an active program of people like you who are doing it. You're in your 9th conference. That's no accident when you think about it. People like you, Lars, didn't exist 10 years ago. And if you did exist, you were probably talking inwards to your own organisation. So you might work for a CRI, your audience was your CRI, and maybe a few stakeholders. In fact, I used to meet with people 10 years ago, and that's what they would talk about. You mean I should talk to people outside? How do I do that? What's the language I should use to talk to someone who doesn't know what IRL does or whatever CRI you might be in? How do I connect with them? What language should I use? Hasn't that changed? Now, pumping out great information, great illustrations, great stories, day after day, that ordinary New Zealanders who may not have a science background but know enough can connect with, and I think that's extremely good. Now, education, of course, has been playing a role in this as well, because it's had an evolving relationship between itself and science, from early childhood to universities, and significant changes, of course, have been underway. Now, I'm not going to tell you an awful lot about this because you can read this for yourself. I think the work that Peter Buckman has done with the paper Looking Ahead Science Education for the 21st Century and the attendant papers on his paper pretty much tell you the story of what's going on. So rather than rehearse that, I just suggest perhaps you sit down. It's a quick read. The papers are quite short, but it tells you pretty much the story in a nutshell. It also raises a whole set of questions, some of which I want to touch on today. Now, those papers together tell you a story of an education system that for a century and a half said science is core to what we do. It's very important for us to have it, but basically it's for brighter students. Basically for brighter students. And you often hear that code today, don't you? Where people talk about the soft subjects. If you go off and do communication or sociology or whatever you might, humanities, God help us, people do those these days because that's a soft subject. People talk about the hard subjects where the bright students are to be guided into. So that sort of sense of science is for a group of special students is still there, and for a century and a half the education system in this country saw it as a responsibility to sort out those students. Who were the people who were bright enough to go off and do science? Because they could in particular do the hardest of subjects, which of course is maths. Since they could do that, they must by definition be brighter than other people, was the general kind of theory. But it was seen certainly as important to have these students come through, and the education system was certainly dedicated to sorting that out. Now, if you looked at the method of instruction, it also suited those kinds of students because it was largely an instructive method. It was about saying to students, you have to stuff your mind full of facts. You have to learn formula. You don't necessarily have to understand them. I'd say most of us in the room are old enough, I think, there's most of us here, to remember our science education, which largely was committed to getting you to regurgitate things rather than to really understand it. So memory and persistence were things that were very important for people who learned in that particular area as well. If you didn't have that, you probably weren't going to succeed so well in that area of science. But things have changed. As that sea change has come along and people have said this is very important, we need to have more people in science, more young people understanding it, coming through and being scientists, we've seen a shift to saying how do we make science more relevant and more real world so that when students are studying it, they kind of get to see why they are studying science a bit more. They get to connect it with real issues instead of saying, why should I do maths? I'm going to go and do X job. They're given a reason to be able to do it because they can see it connects to a real world problem. And you'll see that kind of sea change has been running right through the school system now. So it's much more hands-on, much more inclusive of a wider range of students, and trying to get more students who may not be scientists to brush with science so that they get a bit of literacy in the whole area of science. And that certainly would be one of the success stories, I think, of the curriculum over the last little while. It's been an open-ended curriculum. It's allowed teachers to mould the curriculum in a way which suits the student body that's in front of them, use problems that are relevant to them. If they're on the West Coast, they might study something to do with Honamu. If they're in Auckland, they might study transport patterns because they are relevant to their own particular area, and that's created, I think, a body of students who are much more enthusiastic about science and much more aware of what it might do across a broader range of young people. That's gone into universities. Universities now are changing in the same kind of way. Engineering at Massey, for example, you never got to do anything other than content until your 4th year in the curriculum. Very typical engineering program, 3 years of learning the stuff by rote, getting that content right, and then they would say, now, what do you do with it in the 4th year? In the 1st year now at Massey, you get real life problems to study, to work on. Content is married with practice, and it makes the whole thing a lot more accessible to a whole range of students who are now more interested. So that change is going on. In early childhood, where the curriculum doesn't contain science, but now contains a range of skills that young people from that 2 through to 5 age group are requiring so they might be good at science, is going on extremely well. One of the most wonderful examples of this for me was going to an early childhood centre when I first became the Minister of Education, and going to this centre and arriving and having a couple of young people who were about 4, so they were about this high, coming up with their movie cameras, those little digital cameras that they had. And I said to the person who was running the centre, so what's going on here? This looks exciting. She said, they're making a movie of you, which they will edit and show to the kids when you've gone 4 years of age. Absolutely stunning kind of curriculum that's going on in early childhood. It's no wonder we do the work on early childhood education. And those skills are going to come through and serve those young people as they move on to be acquiring learners and hopefully go off and get interested in science. So that's a concentrated version of what's going on in education in the science education area. It's underlining the main point I want to make. Science was the reserve of the few. It today is the focus of a concerted effort to try and get science to be included by more people in their learning. And we have a lot more literate people as a result of what we're doing in the education sector. And they will come through into being adults and move off and hopefully create a large audience out there. There has been a concern about this. People have said this is dumbing down the science curriculum. It should still be just for the select few who are capable of high-level calculus and so on. But I think in general it has been a success, because if you look at PISA in terms of 2 international ways of measuring our science students, we're at the top. Our top students are just as good as anybody from Finland or the US or wherever you might be. They achieve very, very well, and then right through the body of those students you'll find they're achieving at the same level as our equivalent nations around the world, doing extremely well. So we can say that it has not been that kind of dumbing down that people often criticise. The achievement is still very high, and we've got now all of this science at the centre of the consciousness of New Zealanders. We understand that it's an important thing to be focused on. Science is in the media all the time. It's now seen as commercially saleable, so even TV 1 and 2 and 3 will put it on their screens, and we know they only put things on there if there are eyes in front of the screen, so they know science now is something that people are interested in. Yet, concerns remain. And Sir Peter Gluckman is one of the people who has been pointing out that no matter what happens, and you'll see this in the paper he wrote that I mentioned earlier, no matter what's happened, we're not there yet. We still do not have the kind of country that suits what he refers to, and we all refer to, as the knowledge age. If this is the knowledge age and science is quintessentially at the focus point of that, then we are still sitting in a situation where we have advanced but haven't got to where we want to be. So speech after speech, in fact I was down at the Business New Zealand soiree last night where they begin their year and lots of people come and they all chat about what they want to do. Speech after speech there, everywhere you go now, is redolent with the need for science to connect with business, and the celebration of the need for this connection is going on all the time. And we heard it last night at Business New Zealand that this is what should be happening. Science New Zealand sponsored the evening of Business New Zealand last night to show the connection between the two. It was an interesting display of how far we've come, because that would not have happened 10 years ago. That would have not been the connection between Science New Zealand and Business New Zealand. It's a very good thing to see. And we hear lots of speeches also about the need for New Zealanders to get with the program, that science is where we should be. Now, all of us can take a pat on the back once again for what we will see there last night. The CRI staff who were in communications can certainly take a pat on the back for what they saw last night. That connection is being made, and it's very good that it's happened. But I still think that Sir Peter is right. There's a problem, and this is the way I think we could describe it. Let's move out of science for a moment, outside of science, and say, let's talk about classical music. If you're a classical musician, you will know that over the last little while it's become very unpopular. People go, Didn't happen, people didn't want us to come to the shows. So what did classical music do? It said to itself, we should communicate more with audiences, and we should get our people out of the orchestra and out talking, and we should put them in kind of clothing that makes them look very relevant to the modern day and young and all those kinds of things, give them a good image, communicate them well, good PR, get them in front of school kids, all the kinds of things that need to go on, and try to get the audience more literate. A wider, more inclusive approach to it just sounds like science. Same kind of approach, really, of taking an elite and saying, you've got to get yourself out there and get support, otherwise you're going to not be able to do the kind of job you've got, and we should get you out there and popularise what you are doing. Now what we are saying here is that we've got a model of change, which is saying a group of people separate from society should now become part of society, and that society should get to know them more so that they will support them. But no one plays the cello any more than they used to. No one actually conducts an orchestra any more than they used to. They just appreciate the orchestra more. They kind of get the fact that they really quite like this when they hear about it. They've got a bit more skill now so they can relate to it, and they really like the fact that the people who are in the orchestra look so relevant, very much part of the kind of society they're in. So there's a really nice connection there, but no one's playing the cello any more than they used to before, and that's the problem that we have with science. We have an elite group of people still who are well communicated and an audience that understands them, but no one is doing more science in everyday life than they used to. I exaggerate. There is clearly some more science going on. But we're not seeing the kind of change that St. Peter was talking about, where it becomes embedded in our society, where everyday thinking is about how I use this kind of thing, how do I become a person who is going to make use of this science. Now, I think we have to make a better case for science, is really what St. Peter and others are saying, if we're going to be able to integrate this in this way. I was thinking about this when I went along to listen to a speech by a senior public official a little while ago, and gave a very worthy speech about the importance of science in the usual kind of way. Got to get people literate, got to get more science out there and known about, very usual script. And during the question time, someone said to him, what would you say to an 18-year-old or a 17-year-old or a senior school student? What would you say to them if they asked you a question, why should I go into science? Why should I take up science as a career? And the answer was, you can have a good career. Well, that's true, isn't it? You can have a really interesting career, you get away to wear a lab coat, and talk with interesting people, and you do interesting work, you can have a great career. I thought to myself, as the whole audience did, I have to say, there's got to be something better than this. There's got to be a better answer than we inspire young people by saying, you can have a good career at this. You can have a good career at anything. Science is no different in the sense that it offers you more or less interest in many other things in life. So what is it that's going to switch it on so people start to say there's more to it than me having a career? Now, we use at Massey a man who I think has an answer to this. His name was said Cynic at the end, which is unfortunate really, a turn on his name, Simon Cynic. He's an American business guru. As you know, business gurus all have one idea that's useful, and they usually write 12 books about it. You can actually read the book by just reading the cover at the back. You've not paid the money at all while you're staying in the airport, and that's true of his work as well. But it's a very powerful little idea, and he admits himself it must be the most simple idea that anybody has ever invented. He calls it the golden circle. And what Cynic says is that when we think about organisations, we think about questions like what, how, and why. What do we do, how do we do it, why do we do it? That's the kind of questions you might want to ask. And he says to himself, you might like to try this while you're sitting there, by the way, thinking about your CRI or your university or whatever, ask these questions. What do we do, how do we do, why do we do it? So Cynic says, if you look at these organisations with this point of view, you'll find that most organisations start from the outside in. So they can all say what they do. What do? We deliver mail, we teach students, whatever. How do we do it? We put them in a classroom, we go to a post box, whatever. We can answer that question, that's easy enough to do. But when they get to why, it drains out. In fact, I heard last night a very good illustration of this from the CRIs. I'm sorry I'm picking on you at the moment, but it's just nice to illustrate because you are so wonderful and you're doing such a great job. But I heard someone answer that question in a speech about the CRIs. Why are we here? What do we do? What do we say? And the answer was what. They described what the CRIs do, and they described how they do it. They didn't even touch on the question of why. never went near it. It's a hard question. You think about your own organisation. Why do you do it? Why are you here? What's SCANZ about? You can describe that. How do you do it? You have conferences. But why do you do it? Is Sinek's question. Now, his favourite example, and I won't go through all of his speech because you can click up TED Talks and you will find him on there. Have a quick look at him. But he uses an example which I'll use today. He loves Apple. He loves Steve Jobs. Why not? Very successful business. And he says if you talk to these people, they go from the inside out. They start with why, then they tell you how, and then they tell you what they do. So this is the example he gives of Apple. He says if Apple were using what people normally do, go what, how, why, they would say this. They would say, we make great computers. They are beautifully designed. They are user-friendly. Why don't you buy them? And as he points out, most people would go, why not buy any other computer as well? What's the difference between you and them? But Apple, he says, don't do that. What they do is they say, what we do is we get up every day to answer a challenge. Everything we do, he says, challenges the status quo and allows you to think differently. Our products are beautifully designed, they're user-friendly, we make good computers. I make. And as you know, in 9 months, they sold $30 billion worth of IPs. And the question Sinek asks is, why? What's the difference? And the answer is, they answer that question. The big thing about Jobs is he told you why he produces these computers. It allows you to think differently. And if you listen to the obituaries after he died and read them in the newspaper, you will see person after person said, I bought this and I followed Jobs because he changed the way I related to the world or the way I thought. An amazingly powerful message that he got across that transformed his business, but also transformed you and myself. That we began to relate to these products in a way which told us why we want them, why we had to actually have his stuff and not somebody else's, because we want to be part of what he was talking about. Now that's the problem, I think, that we have with science. We have to answer that question of why. At the moment, we're doing well on communication, but it remains what scientists do, and we appreciate it. But you might be saying, well, how do we come up with an answer for something as big as science? It's easy enough for Jobs, he's running a business with a focus on a particular product. What do we do with science? Well, I think we can. I don't know about you, but when I was a boy, I used to deliver papers, newspapers. These seem to do it on motorbikes, but we used to bike around with enormous boxes in the front. Probably caused everybody to have long-term injuries at some time, no matter weight they carried. But I remember reading in the newspaper about John F. Kennedy, telling the Americans that they were going to the moon. This has become almost a sort of archetypal story, of course, of how you motivate a whole nation by giving them the answer to the why question. Why are we getting up each day to do things? We're going to the moon. This was code, of course, for we're going to beat the Russians. This was code for a competition between the two of us. And American society, as you know, swung in behind that and got to the moon, and they are still living off the impetus that gave to American society, because it lifted people's interest in education, and particularly in technology, which is why Americans are so at the forefront of all this today. It was an enormously empowering way of saying, this is why you get educated. This is why you do science. This is why you should give a damn, as Sinek would say, about science. Because it does things. It's inspiring. And you should get your kids to be involved in this, because they're not just going to get a good career, but look what they can do. And of course, we all sat and sort of bathed, I think, in the notion that man, back then, had got to the moon. And that was a pretty motivating thing. You know, so what's all right then with John F. Kennedy? He could talk like Mr. Obama, he could inspire people. We don't have people like that. So what do we do? Well, last week I was talking to the Israeli ambassador, Ambassador Zerv, who met a very interesting, very tall man. And we were talking about this. I said, I'm going to a science communicators conference, so I'm going to be talking a bit about science. What do you think the difference is between New Zealand and Israel? He said, absolutely in a nutshell and straight away, he said the difference between us is you have great ideas. Israelis have great ideas, but they use them. And they use them all the time. Everybody uses them. And they know they must use them. So there's a whole structure of Israeli society which gets an idea to an application. In fact, we would be remiss, he said, if we were not constantly in our society going through these ideas and moving them through application. You don't do that. What you do is you think these things up and other people use the idea. That's the difference. And I think the difference is what he also said. We do it because we have to. Because if we didn't, we wouldn't survive. You don't have that impetus. You haven't answered that question, in other words, implicitly, in why you do it. We know why we do it. We do it because if we don't have much of a future. So we knuckle down, kids understand that, business understands that, government understands that. We get on with the whole process of making sure that we apply those ideas. Now, we don't have a moonshot, we don't have to survive, but we do have a problem. You know as well as I, we live at a very difficult time. Our economy is not running as we want it to. We have social problems mounting. We have a society where most people do wonder what is the point of our society. A great place to live, but not quite sure what it's all about, what they should tell their kids to do, how they should invest their money. These questions are a mystery because there isn't a real logic out there that answers that question at the present time. And they're frustrated. They want to see how we move this forward. Luckily for us and them, I think we live at a time where the answer is kind of staring us in the face. We live at the edge of the second industrial revolution, as we know. The pace of scientific and technological change is now going at a breakneck speed. And what people around the world are saying is we have such enormous problems from climate change to whatever. Where are the answers? What are we going to do about it? We want the answers. There's a huge, hungry audience out there for science and technology to come up with the kind of answers in areas like this: genetics, life sciences, robots, energy, health, education, virtual reality, nanotechnology, transport, water use, biotechnology, information technology, just a few of the topics, which, by the way, almost lead like a roadmap of strengths of science in New Zealand, with some exceptions. We're strong in these kinds of issues. And then, of course, you look across disciplines and you see nanotechnology, biotechnology, information technology, cognitive sciences all interacting and coming up with some extraordinary things. Food become medicine, medicines become food. It's true, we now have the science, you'll be relieved to know, for self-cleaning clothes. No more dry cleaning, no more of those kinds of issues. So the point I'm making is we live at amazing times, huge opportunities for science, but this will belong to people who are prepared to create the environment for it, to create the enthusiasm and direction for it. It won't come about by itself. It's going to have to be where technologies, institutions and people and businesses see how they can come together to create that ecosystem we talked about in ways that will ensure that we can take that kind of vision forward of how to explore science and apply science. Now, the question we've got to answer is the one that the Israeli ambassador answers. Are we going to carry on thinking up ideas, or are we going to start saying to ourselves, how do we apply those ideas? So at Massey, for example, we've said to ourselves, well, let's have an innovation campus. So in Albany, we've invented ourselves an innovation campus, where we are now trying to build ideas to application in the Auckland scene. Iwi, local government, regional government, business, we're building those connections. So we have to build structures. We have to work with our staff. We have to funnel money into things that are funneling in a different way. We have to put incubators in place. We have to put advice structures in place. We have to put research bodies in place that work back and forwards between the two entities of business coming to us to talk about the idea going into business. We're trying to make those physical connections. Now, this is not what New Zealanders like to hear. We still live at a time where people will get up in front of audiences and say, we don't need a plan. We shouldn't be planning for the future. We shouldn't be doing this kind of thing. It's got to come out of just the enthusiasm organically arise from the activities we've got to do. I don't believe that. I don't believe it would have happened in Israel. I don't think it would have happened in Korea. I don't think any of these nations that are further down the track than us would be there if they didn't actually organise themselves and talk about how to do that. Where does the money come from? What is the role of a university now? What is the role of a CRI? How does it connect all of this together in a way that creates that ecosystem? That's the question that we have to answer. Just take one moonshot style inspiring idea Imagine, for example, instead of saying to a kid at school, you can have a good career, you might say, do you know that there are 9 billion mouths to feed by 2050? 6.97, depending on whether you believe the UN or not right now. 1.2 billion of those mouths by 2025 are going to be middle-class consumers. Feeding that number of people, and that number of people who are going to be looking for health qualities in their food, functional foods, different ways of accessing food, traceability, all sorts of things like that. This is a mission. This is going to be one of the most important questions this century will confront. Are we going to be able to feed ourselves nutritiously, efficiently and effectively as a world or not? We're a food producing nation. We know how to do this kind of thing. Want to do science? Yeah, I'd like to be part of that. I would like to be a person who got up each day that knew I was going to make that possible. That sounds inspiring to me. That sounds like a moonshot to me. That sounds like a point for what the government might talk about, what business might talk about, what parents might say to their kids. You should get into that. You don't have to be a scientist at the lab. You could be someone marketing this, or be an accountant at a firm that's making this happen, but you'll know that there's a real mission about the science, and you'll want to know the science is coming through and being applied to the kinds of things that will make a real difference. So that's what we're trying to do at Massey. We're trying to give people a real sense that education used to be about the accumulated body of knowledge being passed on generation after generation, but there is a higher purpose now in education, and it's called confronting issues which may well destroy us. Climate change, food, water use. These are things that are major issues of huge proportions that we as a nation and we as a world have to come to grips with. We do it through science, but only if we apply the science, only if we make it work for ourselves. That's what we try to use to inspire our students right across the whole spectrum of what they would do. So the take-home message, I guess, for you is to say, you have done a fantastic job of getting us to where we are with science and literacy. But the next question, and the stories we have to talk about now, are so how do we build the infrastructure, real infrastructure, money, people, buildings, organisation that takes ideas to practice in this country? That's what we have to do. So we have to move beyond the science that we admire, the science that we use.